There are those who have mistaken my caution for weakness. Let that be their undoing.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to A Cast of Kings, a Decoding TV podcast about the HBO original series, House of the Dragon. I'm David Chen, and I would also find it weird if my wife went up to someone, touched their face, and called them comely, for a variety of reasons. Joining me today, she is the author of The Unofficial Guide to Game of Thrones, Kim Renfro.
I'm Kim Renfro, and I'm so glad I've never had to take rocks out of a fireplace and put them in a washcloth for a hot pad. Yay for modern medicine.
And joining us also, she is the creator of the Jessie Gender YouTube channel and the director of the movie Identities, streaming right now on Nebula, Jessie Earl.
Hello, I am tired of you constantly mistaking my caution for weakness, David. So here we go. I'm going to go full out today.
Welcome to the podcast. On today's episode of A Cast of Kings, we're going to be discussing Season 2, Episode 4 of House of the Dragon. Now, on previous episodes of this podcast, we've already disclosed that we get these episodes in advance, and the episode titles have not been revealed to us. It does appear as though Season 2, Episode 4's title is on the internet already. It's called The Dance of Dragons. We are not 100% sure that is the title. It seems like it's likely that is the title. So if it's different, the episode of, the podcast episode title will be different than that. But that said, Kim Renfro, you had come up with some guesses for what the title might be before we thought it was A Dance of Dragons, right?
Yeah, I was like, okay, last week we didn't know, and I didn't really guess in advance. And then it was called Burning Mill. And in retrospect, I was like, oh, that's pretty obvious. And so this week, I was like, are we just going straight forward with like Rook's Rest? Are we just naming things after like the notable battle? I also thought a cool title could be Blood and Fire. Obviously, the book upon which this is based is Fire and Blood. But in this section in particular in the book, they describe a scene as taking place among blood and fire. And I was like, oh, that would be kind of like a cool inversion of what we know. Or we could just go with the Red Queen, which is the nickname for Meleys, Rhaenys' dragon, R.I.P., but we'll get to that later. But again, thought it could be some good symbolism.
Basically, Kim Renfro should be running this show, I think is kind of what the conclusion is.
Cut
right?
to me. I mean, season 8 of Game of Thrones, when they weren't giving us episode titles at all until after the episode had straight up aired, I called the finale episode, I thought should be called The Hour of the Wolf, because that is a title chapter from Fire and Blood, actually, but it's about the Starks kind of ascending to a little bit of power. And I still maintain that would have been a better episode title. But
I mean, there's a lot of things that could have been better about that last season. So.
But the titles of the episodes were the biggest among them. But anyway, yeah, so great title suggestions, Kim. We'll see what actually the title is. A Dance of Dragons, though, that is the name of kind of this sequence of events that is well known in Westeros history, right?
Yeah, the Dance of the Dragons is like the nickname for this Targaryen Civil War. And that's been name dropped before in Game of Thrones.
So that's like pulling out one of the big guns. If Dance of Dragons is the name of this episode, which we think it is, pulling out the big guns for the title. It's like, hey, this is the new beginning of something. So we're going to talk about all the stuff that happens in this episode. But before we do, one quick mention. Of course, we're always open to your emails at acastofkings@gmail.com. Love your comments, love your corrections. Last week on the podcast, we talked about the sept that Alicent and Rhaenyra met in and alluded to it as the Sept of Baelor. Got a bunch of corrections writing into acastofkings@gmail.com. Here's one from longtime listener Patrick. Patrick S. writes in to acastofkings@gmail.com. The Great Sept of Baelor was built by Baelor the Blessed, a Targaryen king decades in the future. Since he has not been born yet, he has not built his glorious sept to the new gods. Therefore, the sept Alicent is praying in isn't the Great Sept and is not the one that Cersei blows up. It is a pretty great sept, though. It looks great. End quote.
It's great. So, it's not the great sept. Not the great sept.
Yes, just it looks great. It's not the great. Yeah, so,
Thanks, Patrick.
I think, between Kim and Jessie, they have to keep in mind approximately, I'm going to say, 630 details about the Westeros universe per episode of this podcast. And sometimes we might make a mistake or two, and we appreciate hearing it. And we will always try to be as accurate as possible in describing the world of George R.R. Martin. But appreciate the emails at acastofkings@gmail.com. Keep them coming in. Let's get to the episode. Season 2, Episode 4, directed by Alan Taylor, written by Ryan Condal, longtime House of the Dragon Game of Thrones folks. Let's talk about overall thoughts. Kim Renfro, what did you think of this episode?
This was when I was like, okay, hey, it's the Dance of the Dragons. It has begun. We're in it. It's happening now. I thought this was a really incredible blend of, again, both like wonderful two people in a room talking scenes that we always love and cherish within this medium, combined with like straight up reminding me of the Spoils of War, that epic episode back in Game of Thrones season 7, where we see like Dany unleash Drogon on the Lannister army for the first time. Just incredible work showing the real brutality of what dragon on dragon warfare is really like, and basically precisely why perhaps Rhaenyra and others have spun their wheels for a little bit here, trying to avoid this exact type of bloodshed, or not even bloodshed, like ash shed. Ash blowing.
Jessie Earl, your thoughts on episode 4?
Yeah, I just agree with Kim. I said last week that I thought the show was spinning its wheels just a little bit in terms of like dragging things out just a hair to extend out the season. This episode, I have none of that critique. Like, this felt like it just went full bore into what we've all been waiting for and anticipating. Like, this is finally delivering on the title of the show and like what the show has been pitched as, and it didn't disappoint. Like, I knew that this battle was coming up because I've read the book, obviously, and I was really pumped to see what they were going to do with it. And again, like, I just felt like, oh, this is exactly what I wanted from this. And it did really sell, as you said, Kim, the brutality of what dragon warfare actually looks like. Because up until this point, maybe I'm forgetting one or two here and there, but I mean, I guess you can count the ice dragon in the original Game of Thrones, but for the most part, we really haven't gotten dragon on dragon battling. And this is the first time where we see that, and how it can just be devastating regardless of who is fighting who. And I really love just the sense of scale that we got throughout this whole episode, and the build up to it, and it just felt like it's a really great climax to everything we've been going for so far. And also, as Kim said, like, really great acting scenes. Like, it could have just been a just long action sequence, but no, it was some really great acting, some really great character work that all made the battle at the end feel earned and worthwhile. So just a fantastic episode.
I gotta agree. I think this is awesome. This is filmmaking / television making on a scale that only a show like House of the Dragon can do. Armies of hundreds of people, massive CG dragons coming in and wreaking massive destruction. One of the things that was a big question to me during Game of Thrones was they would often allude to this time when, oh, like, everyone had a dragon. There are dragons everywhere. And it was very difficult for me to imagine, well, how would that actually play out? Because if you have like one dragon, the battle is over, right? Like, there's one dragon can just basically kill everyone. What's the point of even having battles in that situation? And I think that this episode specifically, manages to do a good job of showing what that's like. First of all, you have other dragons. So it's not just one dragon, right? It's like dragons fighting against each other, and that can really help even the score. The second thing is you have to be really careful how you deploy the dragons, because you don't want to just destroy everything. Like, the point is not to just annihilate everything. You want to ideally cause a surrender of the people, or kill a lot of the people, cause a surrender. But you can't just like obliterate everything, or else there's no point in even fighting the battle in the first place. Ideally, you want to take this strategic position, right, with the castle or whatever it is, and I think this shows that as well. And as you both have said, there's interesting character moments as well. So this is really just tremendous episode, really well done, very exciting, very electrifying, and overall had a great time watching this one. So I think we're all in agreement. Awesome episode of the show. But let's talk about what happens on this week's episode. The first battle of the Targaryen Civil War between Queen Rhaenyra and King Aegon takes place at Rook's Rest, bringing about the death of Princess Rhaenys and her dragon Meleys, the possible death of King Aegon, along with the deaths of hundreds of soldiers from both sides. Before we get into the epic dragon on dragon fighting, let's go through what happened with the rest of the realm in this week's episode. So Daemon, he's at Harrenhal. He's still being haunted, dreaming about killing young Rhaenyra. By the way, I saw some comments online about how perhaps it is significant that when Daemon dreams about Rhaenyra, it is of the younger version of her, I should say. And so that's just something to be aware of, because we do see Millie Alcock play the young Rhaenyra. But anyway, during his waking hours, he meets with Oscar Tully, the young grandson of Lord Grover, and next in line to be Lord of the Riverlands. We learn that 2 weeks have passed since Criston Cole left King's Landing with his small army, and they've successfully stormed a few castles, namely Rosby and Stokeworth. So unfortunately, it seems like Criston Cole is actually doing something right for a change, and we'll see exactly how long that lasts. We get a few more spooky Daemon visions. There's an empty version of the throne room at King's Landing, and young Rhaenyra is back, speaking in High Valyrian. But yeah, a lot of Daemon sleepwalking nightmares this episode. To me, as a non-book reader, it seems as though the show is trying to convey that Daemon's going mad a little bit, like his sanity is deteriorating. I don't know, and my guess is if that's true, it will continue to deteriorate. I don't expect either of you to tell me exactly what's going on here, but that's kind of just what my perception is. But anyway, there's another scene where he's like stalking Aemond through the halls, but it turns out it's himself. He is perhaps the true enemy. And he realizes he's been led to Alice Rivers' workroom, where he has an interaction with her. He saw her in a vision, I think, last week. So yeah, what do you make of all this stuff with Daemon at Harrenhal? Like, I gotta say, like, I'm struggling with it a little bit. Like, it feels like the relationship between Daemon and Viserys and Rhaenyra was so interesting in the first season, and even in parts of this season. To have him be separate from everyone else feels a little bit difficult dramatically to me. Kim Renfro, what do you think?
I think as a book reader and as someone who, while watching Game of Thrones, felt like I was missing this sort of lore, spooky, green seeing weirwood trees visions aspect of George R. R. Martin's writing. I like that they're leaning into it with the sort of confusing waking, or is he dreaming? Has he been drugged? Has he, is he just how zoned out is he?
Right.
Like, I see where you're coming from with that being a little bit of a disappointment from him having these like, intense theatrical dramatic scenes with incredible actors, like, seeing like Matt Smith and Patty Considine, or,
Yeah.
even Matt Smith and Emma Darcy, as we mentioned earlier in the season, like had the like tremendous argument episode. And I'm sort of like, oh God, is that like the last time they're going to really let him sort of have that much depth to his character that's not relying on like either quips or this sort of like woo woo, like what's going on in Harrenhal. But at the same time, I'm enjoying it. I thought like watching Matt Smith pretend to be Ewan Mitchell is the actor who plays Aemond. Like watching him sort of like take on that physicality of like being Aemond and then being like, oh, it's me, and like his like little nightgown that he's wandering around in. I liked it, and I like getting a little bit more of like the lore, like the way that Alice talks about like the heart trees, the weirwood trees, which, as you mentioned, I don't know if he saw her in a vision or if he was awake at that point in the last
kind of
episode.
fits her to a degree.
Yeah.
It's like, are you awake or are you dreaming sort of vibe.
Yeah, totally.
Random note about Ewan Mitchell, by the way. Somebody pointed out to me. Have you either of you seen Saltburn?
Oh gosh,
yeah, that was him.
Right. There's this character that the protagonist meets in like one of the first scenes of the movie, who's like basically kind of a loser is the way that he's coded, and it's played by Ewan Mitchell, which is amazing. It's like the complete polar opposite type of guy that he's playing in this movie, which is like in this show, which is like a complete badass.
Yeah, but I'd recognize that jawline anywhere. Yes. I was watching Saltburn. I was like, I know that lower half of a face, even if you've done everything else to distract me from the fact that this is Ewan Mitchell. He's so good. He's such a chameleon.
Jessie Earl, what do you think of the Daemon stuff this season so far?
I'm kind of in the middle of you two. I do struggle with it. I think it is a bit repetitious. Like we got last episode these visions of Millie Alcock, and we're sort of like, oh look, he's having conflicting feelings about his grooming her and having feelings for her, but also wanting to have her position, and it kind of repeats itself here in a bit more elongated sequence. So I do think that it's overdone slightly. That being said, I do agree a lot with Kim in the sense that I do really appreciate that we are getting some of this more mystical, magical element of the Game of Thrones universe that was very present in the original show and in the books, but in this series and in this story is less front of mind. I think the show has done a good job of adding some of that in, like with the Song of Ice and Fire dream stuff of Aegon the Conqueror that sort of comes in and out of the series, especially in this episode later on. So I think having it present here where there wasn't a lot of it in the book itself, because the book really just kind of says like Daemon goes to Harrenhal and chills there for a while. And so I think the show is trying to find something for him to do. And I think having this is really good. And I also appreciate that the visions are much more, I don't want to say literal, but much more directly towards Daemon's state of mind. I think if we go back to Game of Thrones, the original show, a lot of times when we would get visions, they'd be these sort of allusions to the future, like, oh, look, we know what's coming. And sometimes they pay off, sometimes they wouldn't. I think a lot of the like Dany stuff in season 1 and season 2 that we would get that kind of vaguely paid off, but it's so ethereal that it's like, oh, I guess I could squint and see how that fits what happens later on. Here, it's much more like, this is what Daemon's struggling with internally, and to bring back a young version of Rhaenyra, I think it kind of speaks a lot to his state of mind and how he views her. He has infantilized her. He also sees himself as above her, grown up above her, but also this weird protector desire he has over here that's really creepy in numerous senses. And so I think that visually it just is very striking and interesting and works well. I just think that it kind of is a little overlong and a bit repetitious. So I'm kind of in the middle of it. I enjoy it overall, but I don't want much more of it than we've already gotten.
Yeah. I'm curious how it'll evolve as the season continues. Anyway, those are some thoughts on what's going on with Daemon this week. One last thing before we move on, actually, about Daemon. There's a bunch of interactions that Daemon has with other houses this episode, right? Jesse, what did you make of all this stuff?
I enjoyed it. I thought it was a lot of fun. Just the stuff where we get this younger Tully Lord who's just like, oh yeah, my grandfather is, he's knocked out. He can't really speak. He's very ill. And Damon's like, well, maybe you should speed that along so I can get your army. And the kids being like, what? No, I love my granddad. What are you talking about? It's just it was a very funny sequence, but also kind of does two things that I really enjoyed. One, again, shows like Damon's point of view of like, I just need people right now, and sort of this game that he's playing with himself and this desire to have power that he wants, and how he looks down on people who have any sort of vulnerability at all. And how he just hardened himself in that way. But also like the way that this world works is just interesting to me. This very like, we can't do anything unless our Lord says, and our Lord's can't do anything right now, so we can't do anything right now. And this kid sort of having to like carry this burden of being essentially the Lord that in charge, but can't really do much against his grandfather, but also loves him and it's part of his family. Like it was just an interesting complexity added there. And then the other scene later on where Daemon sort of comes back in from the vision. I again love showing Daemon's state of mind there. And also we sort of get this interesting sort of deal where this guy says, well, if you kill or you fight back against the other house, I'll give you my army. So these petty squabbles playing out in larger context, sort of building off of last episode with the Battle of the Burning Mill. So yeah, I just thought it was just interesting political machinations that mixed with Daemon's headspace that I found interesting.
Yeah. You kind of get a sense of the sort of process behind under which these wars take place. It's not just like, hey, we're all just going to join up and unite against the enemy. It's like there's horse trading, and there's like, you do this for me, I do this for you. All this like complicated stuff that goes into it that we do get a taste of in these Harrenhal scenes. So, all right, moving on. A couple scenes with Rhaenys this week. Rhaenys Corlys's wife, visits the dock where Corlys's ship is being repaired and sees Alan, leading to some implicit discussion about Alan's parentage. She touches his face and calls him comely and says his mother must have been beautiful. Um, I gotta say, the Rhaenys and Corlys stuff has felt also a little bit disconnected for me this season. There's literally one set that they use anytime it's kind of a Rhaenys and Corlys or Corlys or Alan or Adam scene, and I'm just kind of like, oh, I guess they're all kind of doing their own thing again this week, But this episode we do get, it is important that we do get a couple more scenes with Rhaenys because obviously what happens to Rhaenys later this episode, and it does seem as though setting up Alan's parentage or who his parents are does seem like it will probably be significant later this season. There's also a scene where Rhaenys and Corlys talk about how Rhaenyra has been absent and her small council has been antsy, which prompts Corlys to go to Dragonstone and help bolster support for his queen. But yeah, what do you make of these scenes with Rhaenys and Corlys at the dock and kind of talking about these new characters that we've just met this season? Kim Renfro, thoughts?
Yeah, it's a great point that they seem to have created this set and the whole story of like Corlys's ship needing to be repaired as just like a very convenient arena for all of these conversations. And like, who knows if they were all filmed in the span of, a few weeks, just all jammed together. It kind of I think Eve Best and Steve Toussaint, who play Rhaenys and Corlys, are so great. Like, I love their dynamic as a couple. I think they have great chemistry, but I agree that it feels a little bit forced that they have like written in. It's not super jarring, but to me, it feels a little bit like I can, like see the hand writing the story here of being like, oh, right, we need to make sure that people really care about Rhaenys, particularly in this episode, care about their relationship. We need a little bit of exposition here. And I feel like someone was like, these actors, it almost feels theatrical. Like it's like they built a play set and we're like, we're just going to put you two beautiful people in here and like give you nice things to say to each other and do some close-ups and great costumes. And I'm like, okay, like, sure. Yeah. Why not?
I think the issue is like the Alan and Adam character, when they're introduced, like there's nothing really specifically that they're doing to drive along some of the major plots. Right?
That's
as of right now. So it's just kind of like, why are we hanging out with these? Like, and I assume it will become obvious later, but right now it's just kind of like, oh, okay, we're spending time meeting these characters and we're being told they're significant, but like we're not sure why exactly yet. And as I don't know if I said this already, but like Rhaenys confronts Corlys about who Alan really is. Who Alan really is. The implication to me being that he is Corlys's son. Like that's kind of how the vibe I got, but it is not confirmed yet. Jesse, any thoughts on these Rhaenys scenes?
I mean, I was just going to say the same thing you said. My issue with them is really just, as Kim said, the hand of the author that you can see here, where it's like, all right, well, these characters are going to be important later, so we got to introduce them, and that's fine. I didn't mind it in the first episode of the season where we met them, where Corlys shows up and sort of explains who they are. But here it's happened multiple times where we get these characters, they appear, and then they just sort of like give vague hints about the context of who they are, and then we move on. And it's like, what are you doing that's pertinent to anything right now? And again, as a book reader, I know what's going to be coming and how that's going to play out. So I see that. But as a show watcher, I'm just sort of like, all right, I get it. Let's have them be involved in this.
Right.
And I think they could have done a better job of integrating them into some other things, like have them be involved in some council stuff, or maybe they were the ones that took Rhaenyra to King's Landing, like help sneak her over there, just to get them out of that set and feel like they're involved in other things. Because here it's just sort of like, well, we need to make sure we introduce these characters before they're relevant to the plot. So let's just have them pop in a couple times and say, hey, I'm here, might be a bastard, talk to you later. And that's really about it. So
yeah. But I do anticipate it'll all make sense in the end. We'll see how it all plays out. Anyway, couple scenes of Rhaenyra's small council, like they're trying to decide what to do in her absence, because again, last episode she went on this daring heist mission into King's Landing to try to prevent the war. Jace defends Baela from being chastised over the survival of Cole and his army. Daemon's still ghosting everyone. Rhaenyra has no army. And Sir Alfred is getting testy. And but then Lord Corlys walks in and everyone just shuts the F up because Corlys commands a lot of attention and respect. So
he's a man, a grown man.
He's a dude, so he can get that. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You need it's so important to have a dude in situations like this. So yeah. All right. So that's a lot of what goes on in the Rhaenys and Corlys episode. Let's talk about Alicent. Alicent's story this episode is centered around her desire to prevent more pregnancies and the struggle she already has with her difficult to manage son. So the opening of her scene this episode is her dropping the stone dragon she had once prepared for Viserys. She's having a tough time this episode because she knows that she made a mistake in interpreting Viserys' dying words. We see Master Gerardus come in and give her some moon tea. I really enjoyed this scene where she's like, hey, so what do you think Viserys really meant? What do you think he really meant? And then Master Gerardus has the most diplomatic answer possible. Oh, well, it's beyond my expertise. He never spoke about that stuff to me. So, which is exactly the answer you should give in that situation if you want to not die. So I really thought that was lovely. We also see, as you indicated in your intro, Kim, that she's seen making a medieval heating pad for cramping, which was done by putting hot rocks into a cloth, right?
Yeah, that's what it looked like.
Yeah.
Which honestly, very inventive. Sure, whatever works.
Yeah.
It's interesting because to me, moon tea is a fascinating beverage that George R. R. Martin dreamt up for the purposes of his story, where it I've heard some people be like, oh, it's just like Plan B being the real medication in our real world that one can take after having unprotected sex that prevents a pregnancy from taking root, for lack of a better word.
And Kim's reaction is, how dare you undersell the benefits of moon tea in that situation, right?
Basically. But it's interesting because moon tea is not just a preventative beverage. It is also it can also basically induce a miscarriage or an abortion, for lack of a better word.
Right.
So the fact that...
So it's like a combination of the pill and Plan B in our world, right?
No, it's because Plan B does not cause miscarriage or abortion to take place, right?
No, that's fair. Yeah,
so it's I don't know what the term for it. I don't know if there's a generic term for it like Plan B, but it's a combination of Plan B and a type of medication that they can give you once you are already pregnant.
Right.
Basically abortion tea.
Right.
Yeah.
I wouldn't.
Sorry. Basically.
But basically it's more powerful than anything we have in our planet.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
Yes. And so the fact that she is cramping within hours after taking it tells me that she was already pregnant, that her and Kristen have accidentally conceived a child during their trysts, and she is solving that problem basically for herself. So yeah, interesting layers to where her headspace is this week. Not only with her sort of reeling from the revelation that Rhaenyra handed to her last episode about the fact that you definitely misinterpreted dear old dad's words. Wrong Aegon. Maybe should have asked some more clarifying questions about which Aegon he was whispering to you about. But the fact that and the fact that she is still sort of seeking out this is in our notes to talk about in a little bit, but the fact that she seems to be desperately looking for a book that Viserys might have left behind that mentions the story of A Prince That Was Promised or the Song of Ice and Fire. So her kind of going through all of that while also apparently just recovering from a induced abortion that she has with her lover, who she doesn't even seem to like that much.
She's having a rough week.
She's having a rough week. Yeah.
Interesting. Interesting developments here. I'm curious to what end she's looking for this information. What does she hope to gain? Because like I said, as a supporter of Team Green, she was right. Like, you can't take backsies of this. Like, it's not like you can call, but maybe she just wants to know for herself. I do think, in retrospect, if your significant other is dying and near delirious and on their deathbed, maybe not a good idea to start a war based off of stuff you think they might have said in those moments. Like, and probably she's coming to that realization as well. But yeah, there's also a moment where Laris comes in. Laris just seems to know everything that's happening. Like, he knows she's pregnant. He knows what the moon tea's for, and also notices that she's been reading the history books and so on. I am curious, like, what would be the implications if she did get pregnant, because she's not married at this point, right? So, like, it would probably be some scandal of some kind, right? Like in the Westeros world.
Yeah, there'd probably be some attempt to try to make sense of it, like some propaganda, but I don't even know what they would use as propaganda for this,
I wonder if I think that it's probably only been at this point like a month since Viserys died. She could try to spin it.
I guess, yeah, that's true. It's like, we boned on his deathbed,
Yeah.
He's the Strom Thurmond of Westeros. He can still have children when he's in his 60s or 70s or whatever it was.
You guys all saw him. He made that walk down the hall, no problem. We definitely had sex later that night. He was fine.
Yeah.
I will say I did really like that Laris sequence where she basically just talks herself into like, it doesn't really matter. And I think it kind of goes to what she's looking for, if she wants some sort of proof, but ultimately she just sort of realized like, not much I can do. And I think it's just her working through that emotionally. Like, we talked about that last week of her understanding that with Rhaenyra consciously, but I think emotionally she still needed to process it. And I think getting to that with Laris was an interesting sequence. So
I am curious if she's gonna like find the book or whatever that she's like, if she's gonna basically discover for herself that Rhaenyra was correct, and if that's going to lead to some big character moment later on this season or in a subsequent season of the show, right? Where like that guilt, causes her to perform some action out of her conscience. I'm curious. Anyway, I'm not asking you to actually spoil me on anything. I'm just saying, like, I wonder, like, what the point of her doing any of this is, with regards to doing the research. So
yeah, I wondered it too, because this isn't necessarily spoiler. Like, the stuff with the Song of Ice and Fire really doesn't come up in the book all that much. Like, they're not really talking. Like, there's aware that there is a prophecy, but it doesn't really play into that.
It's not, and they don't call it that either, right? They don't. They don't refer to it as a Song of Ice and Fire.
No,
in the book, right?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit of like trying to connect the events of this to, like, when they brought it up in season 1, it really did feel like, oh, we want to try and like wink towards the audience that this is going to have some implications for the show that you did watch. Like, who ends up on the throne here does matter down the line. But here now it is being used in a sort of character-centric way and playing into characters' feelings on it. I am curious ultimately too how it's going to play into, because I could see it going either way. I could see it being either something that just ends here and the characters just go like, well, doesn't really matter after
Let's
this
let
point.
bygones be bygones, I guess.
But the fact that we get it sort of reiterated later on with Rhaenyra telling her kid about it as well and passing it on, like, again, could just be a sequence of like, oh, her doing what her father did, and you can see this lineage. So it could just be an element of just re-showing that, or it could be them leaning into some setup for possibly bringing it up down the road. So yeah, I am curious to see how it's going to go. I will say it has been personally I don't even want to say least favorite, because there's been elements of how I've liked it used, because again, it does lend some weight to, oh, this connects to the original show that I do enjoy, but ultimately it just feels superfluous and needless and led to some of that sort of like, oh, maybe he said it on his deathbed stuff that I hate, the like miscommunication plot lines, especially when it's so meaningful in this context. So I could take it or leave it either way, but I am curious to see what their plan is for it.
I thought it was inserted here for a bit of dramatic irony, because we know, again, this was something that seemingly was invented for House of the Dragon, but the dramatic irony is that the prophecy is inscribed on the Valyrian steel dagger that Aegon is wearing, that like was Viserys and was passed on to him. And so like the fact that Alicent is like digging around for like a book that might tell this story, and the reality is that it's right in front of her on Aegon as she's like dressing him down, combined with the fact that a little bit later we see that Aegon and we know Alicent are not very well versed in High Valyrian anyways. So like maybe Aemond is the only person who might have the wherewithal to like actually interpret and like translate what's on that blade. But
and he gets it at the end of this episode too.
Yeah, so. Like I think that was all sort of like an intentional tie-in of like again bolstering the Team Black support of being like Rhaenyra is the one who has the full story and understands everything to do with this prophecy because she was the actual named heir. If Aegon had ever been considered as part of Viserys's like true line of succession, then like he might have been more clued into the fact that this, not only like the significance of that blade, but just like the story in general. But it is interesting because yeah, I don't know if within the universe with George R. R. Martin, if there's really any like official book that has this type of prophecy. I'm pretty sure that it's only mentioned in like some scrolls that are found much, much later on by Jon Snow's dad, which is a whole other tangent that we could go down.
Yeah. So it's interesting.
Aegon. Remember how Jon Snow's real name is also Aegon? Yeah. There's too many Aegons.
It's interesting to reflect on how like they're giving it a place of such primacy in the show. They've referred to it so many times in the show already. And also interesting, given that we kind of know based on Game of Thrones where that all ends up, you know, like
right.
It's not like it's like a particularly satisfying place. So I'm really
right.
I'm wondering like what the point of all the references to Song of Ice and Fire are going to be. But we'll see. You know, I assume they know what they're. I assume they know what they're doing, and we're going to find out. With regards to the dramatic irony piece, I do think that one of the things that this show has put out is this idea of like near misses, right? Like, oh, if only this thing happens slightly differently, like the war would have played out much differently, right? Like, and examples being like the whole Viserys thing. Like, if Viserys hadn't said shit that night, like the war might not have happened. Or if Aemon's dragon hadn't, if it had been like 30 feet to the left instead of 30 feet to the right, like the war might have not have started. Or like just basically these things that are like just barely missed, and maybe the idea of the prophecy being on the dagger kind of fits in with that. We'll see. I don't know if they're gonna go that way with this, like that she's gonna discover the dagger and be like, it was here the whole time, I can't believe it. I don't know if that's the case, but that's an interesting fact to bring up, Kim. So anyway, but let's get to the rest of the episode, which is a slow build up to the Battle of Rook's Rest. We see the aftermath of one of Cole's attacks on the harbor town of Duskendale, where Lord Darkland is beheaded after refusing to kneel for Aegon. Cole gets a raven and announces that the army is going to head to the coastline instead of Harrenhal. This is actually a really cool scene, I think, because it makes you hate Kristen Cole even more, which is like what we always love that. But it also shows that Kristen Cole is like, this guy's got some skills. Like he actually knows what he's doing. Like he is asking everyone to join or be killed, and then he's taking an unconventional path into battle. Right? He's going not instead to Harrenhal, not to Harrenhal, but to this other place where no one anticipates, and maybe there's strategic value in that. So anyway, I thought there was some really good stuff here, and like a really effective scene. Kim, any thoughts on this?
I love the shot of him, like the ruthless beheading of the Lord, like just,
yeah.
It was like another day in the office for Kristen Cole. Like, oh, there we go. And like the way that the camera sort of tracks with him, and we see everybody bow, like bending the knee while he like wipes the blood off his blade. Just a really incredible shot. And yeah, really adds to the power of his character. I believe around this point in Fire and Blood, he basically gets the moniker of Kingmaker. So you see that in this episode. I think like this was like Kristen Cole's like Kingmaker episode, where you're like, oh, like right, his strategizing is working, his ruthlessness and efficiency is absolutely helping gain momentum for Team Green here. And even though things don't go to plan, as we will enumerate on later, he still ultimately comes out with a win.
Anyway, we get a scene of Aegon yelling at his small council about how Harrenhal has already been taken by Daemon, and then Aemond tells Aegon that Kristen Cole is heading to Rook's Rest. And Aegon gets annoyed that people aren't telling him important details, starting to become aware he's not really the one in charge anymore, starting to get a really big chip on his shoulder, and that's obviously going to create some circumstances that lead to the tragic events later in this episode. The enmity between Aegon and Aemond starts to come to a head, and Aemond gets bolder when he reveals that Cole and him are strategizing the army's movements together. The conversation switches to High Valyrian, and it's made clear that Aegon can't speak the language as fluently as his brother. Always embarrassing when your sibling shows you up in a language you're both supposed to know. This was true of me when my brother and I were in Chinese school when we were kids, and really felt for Aegon here in this scene. But
there was so much relatability in specifically struggling to like conjugate the right verb. I feel like anyone who's ever taken a language class, but like how he's trying to figure out how to like, he says like, I can have to make a war. Like he just like couldn't quite land on exactly the right verb in the right tense. And it's also like such a stark contrast to the way that Daemon and Rhaenyra speak in Valyrian to one another, both in season 1. You even got a glimpse of it in the vision that Daemon was having earlier in this episode. You can see that like there's a huge difference between the members of the family that have been really steeped in their Valyrian heritage from the get-go versus Aegon and Aemond, who were raised much more under the sort of high tower tilt of things. And it's really only the fact that Aemond has had this sort of obsession with dragons and his more Targaryen side. That's the reason why he can sort of break out this party trick at the small council and embarrass his brother. So
yeah, I really like the dynamic between Aegon and Aemond. Even just the way they physically carry themselves is quite different, and you can tell that Aemond is much more confident in his skills and abilities, and Aegon is really just trying hard to prove himself. Jessie Earl, any thoughts on these scenes between Aegon and Aemond, as well as their dynamic?
No, I tend to agree with both of you. I really am, I just both of their performances, I do really, really enjoy. This season has done a really good job of, we've been praising Aemon's performance, Aegon's performance, this entire season, and we haven't given as much to Aemond, but he is also, they've done a really good job of just showing how he is a very sensitive soul deep down, but also has to harden that. And he's also very competent. He knows how to do things. He's actually a decent strategizer, but he is also one who begrudges people what he views as slights against him, or things that he is owed, mostly because he thinks he's better. And frankly, he is more competent than them. And that, like that, we saw that play out the end of last season with Rhaenyra's son that he kills in a very sort of spit of anger and wanting revenge. But also it plays out later on this episode where he, as we'll talk about, he delays going into action and letting Aegon take the brunt of Rhaenys' first assault and getting himself hurt. So yeah, Aemond I find to be a very fascinating character that has been quietly built up in the background of the show, but when he comes to the fore, he is wildly important and plays a dramatic role. So I really do adore Aemond's characterization, and getting to see him in these scenes, I think, just showcases that in really smart ways.
Definitely. At the next small council meeting, Aegon gets a report about the livestock supply issues and decides the discussion is boring. When he complains to Alicent about the woes of being king, she dresses him down and leaves him to his solo day drinking. This is a really interesting scene. And honestly, it's kind of one of the most interesting elements of watching Game of Thrones and House of Dragon for me, especially having watched The Crown and now learning a lot about, like, separately from watching The Crown, learning a lot about the actual monarchy, is that like is you kind of get empathy for these characters in these situations where they have been placed in these situations against their will. It's not like they chose to be king. And their role is largely to be figureheads. Like, in fact, like they have this whole infrastructure around them that wants to control what is happening. Right? You see this for both Rhaenyra and Aegon. Like, no one cares what Rhaenyra or Aegon actually think. They know what is best. They think they know what to do. What is the best course of action? And they would just prefer it if these characters did nothing, right? They prefer it if these characters did and said nothing. And what the show does is it puts you in the perspective of the character that's supposed to do and say nothing, and like how frustrating that is. Shows you how frustrating that is, how challenging that is. So I thought this was great, showing Alicent kind of basically saying, "You have no skills, you have no game. Please shut the f up and let the adults handle things." And like, the situation that puts Aegon in is obviously unfortunate. So, yeah. Any other thoughts on this? Kim, any reaction to this?
The contrast between Alicent speaking with her son and Rhaenyra speaking with her son in this episode is, again, just fascinating, and I think adds to the depth of what all four of those characters are kind of dealing with and up against. Also, the fact that, like, as we were just talking about Aemond and sort of his confidence and competence, obviously he has sort of this like direct line to Daemon in a lot of ways. In season 1, we saw that Aemond is like really kind of like thirsting for a confrontation with Daemon. Even just, last episode, a couple episodes ago, Aemond kind of like saw it as like a badge of honor that Daemon would like want to assassinate him, like, oh, I'm so important. And they're both second sons. Like, that is a very big theme in George R. R. Martin's writing and in the sort of the dynamics of the monarchy, is the fact that being a second born son kind of is just being born into having a whole host of psychological issues, basically, because you are not given a place of primacy. You are not raised under the assumption that you will one day be important to the realm. And with both Daemon and Aemond, the fact that they like feel the need to prove their value and their worth to either their big brother or their mother, it's all very complicated. But yeah, Alicent was just brutal in this scene to Aegon, and I don't think she was wrong in anything that she was saying. But it's
she has reason to be annoyed by this point, like,
yeah.
Otto, her father, has been dismissed,
Right.
and Kristen Cole's off trying to do a assassination parent trap situation. So it's like she's not happy with him, and so it makes sense why she'd behave that way.
Right. But, and it's like, a more magnanimous mother in that circumstance might be like, oh, like, maybe we can have this be like an actual teaching moment, or maybe like, let's really sit and talk about like what is it that's happening in the small. And it's also interesting that she's not even in the small council meetings anymore. Like, she went from at the start of this season to like telling Otto, like, you need to be backing me up in these conversations, because like, if I'm going to have any sort of control over my sons, then like they need to respect what I'm saying. And the fact that Otto's now out of the picture, the last time we saw her at a small council meeting, she was having like a passive aggressive lovers quarrel in front of everybody. And now she's at the point where she's just not even showing up because she is presumably tending to her own abortion woes and also like trying to dig up Viserys's old books. Like, she's like so preoccupied and off the map with like trying to even be involved anymore, that I think it's interesting that this is where we kind of see that lash out happen.
We do see the results of Cole and Aemon's plans as they're being set into motion. The Green's army is given an order to march during the day to Rook's Rest, instead of waiting for nightfall, in order to avoid the sight of any dragon scouts from Rhaenyra. And they're basically baiting Rhaenyra into sending a dragon to Rook's Rest. So she returns to Dragonstone. She's like, guess what, everyone? Y'all were right. The war cannot be prevented. And I'm cool with us fighting now. So anyway.
War crime time. War crime time.
Rhaenyra walks in right as Jace is addressing the council. He's been increasingly annoyed with his mom, and they have it out after she reveals the excursion that she had to see Alicent. And then we're off to the battle. But any thoughts on this whole stuff before we get to the actual battle itself?
Well,
Yeah, go ahead, Jesse.
Kim mentioned the difference between how Rhaenyra addresses Jace and how Alicent addresses Aegon. I really do adore Jace's frustration at Rhaenyra that he expressed here, and it's legitimate. It's like, hey, we're trying to fight a war here. Where did you go? And it felt like this was an actual earned frustration. And then when she explains herself and says, like, I needed to know that if I was going to get a lot of people killed, that there was no other way to avoid that. I don't want to dive headlong into it. And the way it's performed, Jace seems to kind of accept that and respect that. Like, there's no more like, well, like, it wasn't what, like, if it had been Aegon, you would have gotten the sense of him like, well, we should just go right into war. We should just start fighting. We should just get going. And we don't get that from Jace. He's angry, but then accepts the response and like, oh yeah, that makes sense, and I respect you for doing that, even if I don't necessarily think it was the smartest move at this time. And then we get that scene immediately after where Rhaenyra shares the Song of Ice and Fire, like something that's just something that only parent to a child would be able to tell in this family. It's a moment of respect. And I really just, you can see how, despite everything, Rhaenyra actually seems to be a decent parent, and Jace seems to be a decently well-adjusted child, considering the situation that he is in. And so I do think that that's a really interesting juxtaposition on how to treat your kids and to raise them and bring them up. Like all of Rhaenyra's kids seem to be decently well adjusted compared to, Aemond and Aegon, and again the second son idea that Kim was talking about, and like the emasculization that makes a lot of second sons feel in a lot of ways, and how Daemon feels emasculated too. And I don't know, it just proves to me more and more that Rhaenyra is definitely the right choice for the realm. Team Black all the way. But I also just think goes to the larger themes of how do you handle power? How do you build something supportive with power? How do you build something sustainable with power? And that I think the show is just constantly aiming at.
Or counterpoint, Alicent is just giving some tough love to the kids.
Well,
and in this specific instance, it obviously backfired horribly. But maybe most of the time it would have worked.
David, just tough love parent. That's what I'm getting for you.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think it's even more big picture than just like Alicent's one conversation with Aegon in this scene, or even like just like the adult Alicent that we've seen. But like the fact that Rhaenyra has been able to raise her kids this way and have that relationship with them, I think it's also a credit to their fathers, like plural here. Like the fact that they both had like Sir Harwin as like their biological father, but he was clearly there and in their lives as like a protector, and certainly as like a positive force in Rhaenyra's life for the time that he was alive. And then Laenor, we know, like she had a very great, like loving, if not platonic, relationship with him. And we heard Jace talk about the fact that like Laenor, was always there for them and like tried to be the best father that he could be to them. And like, again, it's not just that Alicent is the one who has struggled here with her children, but clearly Viserys was like a totally like absent father, whether that's entirely because of his illness or not, but like he clearly neglected his children after Rhaenyra, and we see the detriment of that absolutely coming to the fore here. Like the fact that Aemond and Aegon are so at odds with one another that the events that we're about to discuss actually unfold the way that they do is like, it's like, Rhaenyra's children would never, but also Laenor and Sir Harwin's children would never, because they were raised to actually be like a team and a unit, whereas clearly we can see that Viserys and Alicent failed to raise their children as any sort of like bonded team who are going to work together through conflict, and instead are going to murder ? One another, or like, or at least incredibly threaten one another, and yeah, it's tragic.
Well, I can't contradict any of that, Kim. I can't contradict any of that. I do want to say there is one other moment to point out that's of note, which is there is obviously a big consequential decision here, right? Which dragon should they send? And Jace wants to go, but she doesn't want to risk another one of her children. And Rhaenys volunteer. Like Rhaenys is like, you have to send me. I'm the one that makes the most sense. Meleys is the biggest dragon they have. So, and Rhaenys is one of the most experienced dragon riders. So it's got to be Rhaenys. Obviously, something that's going to end up being a very fateful decision. All right. So the sense of impending doom increases as we watch Aegon decide to drink and drive his dragon while Rhaenys prepares to fly to Rook's Rest. But yeah, we also see Rhaenyra telling Jace about the Song of Ice and Fire prophecy, her justification for finally escalating the war. And yeah, we already talked about how her pep talk to Aegon, Alicent's pep talk to Aegon, backfired. It did the opposite thing. You know, it was the old reverse psychology there. Got him to get on the dragon and ride and try to intervene on his own, which obviously is not something that we want to have happen. But anyway, so shall we get to the battle, or is there anything? I think we've already talked about the Song of Ice and Fire and all that stuff, right? Let's get to the battle, yeah.
The only other thing talking about Aegon drinking that I was going to mention is there was like a nice bit of visual foreshadowing when he like smashes his like little like wine goblet, and we sort of focus on that for a second, and I was like, oh, it's Sunfire. Like his dragon Sunfire is like notably very like golden and shining, and the fact that by the end of the episode Sunfire is laying smoldering on a forest floor. Sad, but great directing, Alan Taylor. Way to go.
The battle begins in earnest. Men scatter when a speck of dragon appears in the sky, and Cole sends flares up. And the audience finally sees that Aemond and Vhagar have been lurking in the nearby forest, waiting to spring the attack on whichever dragon Rhaenyra sends. But Aegon soars into the fight first, and Aemond decides to let his brother and Sunfire fight it out with Rhaenys and Meleys. The whole battle sequence is really cool. Just you get a sense of the epic scale, but also like this moment was really cool when you know that Kristen Cole has a plan, and the whole episode he's been building up to this plan, and then like it's like, okay, time to trigger the plan, and then literally before it can happen, Aegon comes in, and like we the audience know more than like the characters in the show in this like bit of dramatic irony that I thought was kind of cool. But yeah. Like very, very cool moment when like Kristen's like, okay, well, time to improvise, and like we're just gonna go in anyway. But anyway, Aemond finally gets into the fight and unleashes Vhagar on both Sunfire and Meleys, causing Aegon to fall from the sky. So this happens like relatively early on in the battle, I think, right? Like, and it was shocking. It's shocking. First of all, it's shocking that a king is like in there getting mixed up into battle, and then Aemond just like lights him up. No hesitation. Really, you can sense that Aemond really was not happy about, getting discovered at that brothel last week. And so he's like, I'm going to make Aegon pay for this. But yeah, like just like every other scene, there's something mind blowing happening in this sequence of the show. Jesse, any reactions to anything going on thus far?
I mean, I think we already touched upon it, but the biggest thing for me was just that moment where Vhagar sort of like starts waking up, and then Aemond tells him to wait because he sees Aegon. I thought that was a really interesting character beat. Also, just Vhagar just waking up in the forest was just a very cool visual. Just him hiding there and be like, "Oh, this giant freaking dragon just chilling." And we did get a hint towards this too earlier in the episode, because I think in the council they were talking about being barely able to feed the dragon. So like there were hints that this was the plan the whole time. So I did appreciate that. I did really also love Aegon sort of like, oh, thank God, or whatever. He said something, thank the gods, or whatever he says when Vhagar shows up. And then he's like, oh, shoot, he's going to blow fire on me as well. Again, just showing like Aemond doesn't give a crap about his brother, and really just wants to be able to be like, I deserve to be in charge of this thing. And he plays it smart where he's not necessarily willing to just out and out murder his brother, but he's not going to do anything to save him either. He's going to let him just be an idiot and get in there and put himself and do what he needs to do.
He's got a lot of plausible deniability.
Yeah, plausible deniability.
It's like, I lost control of Vhagar for a second, or we were aiming at Rhaenys, but like the fire accidentally went a little bit off course.
Yeah.
Kim, any thoughts on the early parts of the battle here?
I also loved seeing Vhagar in the forest. It almost reminded me of like Jurassic Park or something, like just seeing like the forest terrain and the dragons within that was so different than sort of like where we've seen these dragons in any other context. I thought that was so cool. Also just like the neat detail of like when Aegon and Sunfire finally crash to the ground, there's like a straight up explosion, and it like really reminds me of like a plane crash or something, like, like
Yeah,
the idea that like a dragon would like emit some burst of fire as it hits the ground, just I don't know.
That's a cool
because
concept.
that's how they work. Again, the whole like dragons as nuclear weapons analogy here. It's almost like seeing like the bomb accidentally go off once it hits the ground somewhere else.
How does the internal combustion of a dragon work? Like
Great question.
There's just like you got to imagine there's just tons of gases being stored up in that thing, right? That are then just lit on fire at a moment's notice. And obviously, when it goes crashing to the ground, sometimes it can go boom. Anyway, go ahead, Kim.
Yeah, I also sometimes wonder about the mechanics of dragons. Also, the fact that like the dragons in Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon are technically wyverns, not dragons, or not all of them. Someone correct me. Now I have to go back and look at all of their hands and feet. But yeah, I have mythology questions. And the little detail
hold on. Okay. We have to let's just clarify what that is, right? So wyverns have two legs.
Yes, and then like their wings act as basically like their forearms, right?
Right. And whereas a dragon has four
legs.
Yes.
And I'm pretty sure that all the dragons in this world are wyverns, technically. But someone tell me if one of these breeds that we've seen.
Yeah, because it's supposed to be like reminiscent of a snake, which is why you hear like in Lord of the Rings, you'd hear Smaug, the dragon, be referred to as the Great Worm spawn. So
yeah.
Well, gross oversight from George R. R. Martin or whoever designed these things.
How dare you? The gruesomeness of like when Meleys and Sunfire are first going at each other and like they're like clawing each other, and we just see that shot of like buckets of blood hitting the soldiers on the field, and it's like, okay, not only are you trying to like not get stabbed or shot by an arrow on the battlefield or get like smashed by a dragon's foot or burned alive, but like you might also just take like blood to the face, and like that might be the thing that takes you out temporarily. It's just like having like suddenly being soaked in dragon blood. So gnarly.
It almost seemed like blood from like the movie Aliens, like where it's like
acid,
acid blood. It almost felt like it was like creating some discomfort for them beyond just being blood.
Yeah.
But what's so cool about what you described, Kim, is just you see how one dragon would take out another, which is just by like ripping it to shreds, and it's visceral and it's like brutal and it's just extremely bloody and messy, and just like it's like I don't think I've ever seen anything like that before. I don't think I've seen dragon on dragon fighting at this caliber before, just in anything,
Yeah,
I haven't watched Reign of Fire yet, so I got to get around to that. But, anyway,
somehow I don't think it will live up to this that movie.
yeah. But when the dragons are going against each other and like ripping skin off each other, it's like, oh wow, you really sense like how not only how powerful these things are, but also how like vulnerable they are too. Like another dragon goes and puts a claw on your chest, and like next thing you know, your insides are leaking out, and then next thing you know, you're dead. And so I thought it was just like I said, every other scene we're witnessing something we haven't seen before.
Yeah.
Anyway,
the tactic of like Vhagar, because like Aemond finally gets in the fight, Sunfire goes down, and then like we see Rhaenys kind of like make the calculation of like, all right, I'm going back in. And that was when I was like, oh, she like, this is like a suicide run, basically, is like what it felt like.
There is this moment when she kind of like decides like, oh, it like, I guess I got to go back in. And she knows that she could die, that it's a very nice acting moment of that realization, I thought, right?
Yeah. So. And then like, that's when the next thing that Vhagar does is like grab Meleys and like, in midair, like hold her like under her and start like roasting her, like the dynamics of like okay, we could claw the dragon out of the air, we could bite the dragon out of the air, we could just hold the smaller dragon under us and roast them until they can't anymore. And then like Melee starts roasting back. So there's like fire going in every direction. It was just like so, yeah, it was so cool, for lack of a better word, of just like all the different concepts that they were able to believably pull off here of the way that this fight might unfold.
Yeah. I mean, I'm curious, is it how you both imagined? Because this is the first dragon on dragon fight we've seen in the show, really, right? Like, is it how you imagined it? Is it more spectacular? Is it less spectacular? Like how did it match up with kind of what you imagined this would play out as?
I mean, for me, it played out exactly as I was hoping it would, and they added some just cool details. I mean, you've already talked about the shredding of the dragon, and I really loved Rhaenys just character beats in here, where she makes the decision to turn back. She's like, "I'm probably screwed, but but I'll do it anyways." And you get that come across. Her accepting her death as she falls too was also a powerful moment. So like giving those beats to her worked for me, and also just the shot from like the ground where you see them like sort of like spitting in the air and just fire going everywhere. I can't imagine it being a soldier in that battle being like, that's cool and awful, and man, they're gonna fall right on me, aren't they? So like it was just the filmmaking throughout all of this I thought was really great, because it gave you a lot of different perspectives on how this would feel, both from the ground, both in the air, both in the point of view of the dragon, and also the point. I really did love the moment where Rhaenys' dragon did die, because you could see him looking back at Rhaenys and having that moment of connection between the two of them, and then passing away. It was very tragic and dark, and you could really feel the sadness of it. And something too that we haven't really talked about with this is, there are so few dragons left. I mean, by the time of Game of Thrones, there supposedly are none other than the 3 that Dany gets. And even before then, they think they're all gone. And so to see 2 dragons here get killed is a really deep tragedy, considering there used to be hundreds of them before the fall of Valyria. So it's I love that this moment is played for the tragedy and the sadness that it is. Like, we talk about them as nuclear weapons, but they are creatures, and like really beautiful, majestic creatures in some senses too, that are being lost here in this battle. So it's not just the destruction of the realm, it's not just brother fighting brother, it's the death of these really unique creatures being removed from the world, and that's very sad. So I liked that it all of that just comes across in so many different ways, and they managed to get all those beats and hit all those beats within all of this. So it's just, they're doing a lot in the space of just a very short time that I thought was really brilliant filmmaking and acting, and just all around just great artistry.
Beautifully said. Kim Renfro, any other thoughts on, like, was this as you imagined it? Because I imagine you imagined it before you watched this, right?
It was. I think the thing that took me even more pleasantly by surprise, or that I hadn't really maybe been properly imagining in my head, was like the scale difference between Vhagar and the other dragons, like, which they've been emphasizing. And to great effect. But once again, in this scene, smartly using the way that Vhagar's size and weight is both an advantage to her and a disadvantage at times. Like, literally the whole bit where Vhagar kind of like hits the ground, like hits the battlefield, almost again like a plane sort of like skidding on a tarmac, and like you just see her trying. It's almost like she's so big that she couldn't quite get like weight under her wings again to like to not land on all of presumably mostly like their own soldiers. Again, showing how dragon warfare is not just deadly for your enemies, but it can also just be deadly for your own side. I thought was like a great choice, because exactly to what Jessie was just saying about the way that they were able to give us multiple perspectives of these dragons was what I hadn't quite been able to visualize before. And now I'm like, oh, I really know. I now feel like I know what it feels like to be on a battlefield looking up and seeing dragons, or seeing a dragon foot come down on my head, and like that's how I die. Just really, really great. And again, tragic is certainly the word for it. I feel like I wasn't as I was weirdly like, by the time that Rhaenys was, like falling to her death, I felt like I was going to be more emotional in that moment. And by then I think I was more just like in awe of everything that was happening, that like it didn't really hit me as sad, if that makes sense. It was more just like, I was like, that's an epic way to go out. Like it felt like, sure, like that's a dragon rider's death. And like, she seemed to accept it. Like, and maybe because there wasn't really anyone else from her family there to be like reacting to it. I don't know. But that part was interesting to me. I feel like I did expect to feel a little bit more sad about that death.
I think hopefully we'll get. I mean, I'm sure we'll get some stuff with Corlys over the next few episodes, and I'm sure that'll bring it home. But yeah, I did hit with the awe of it. I actually felt sadder at the dragon's death than I did at Rhaenys' death.
Yeah,
and not to say I love Rhaenys, great character. So I'm not like saying I didn't care about her.
But there's billions of Rhaenyses in the world. Like there's only like 6 dragons or whatever, right?
Yeah.
I do love that they gave Rhaenys like this moment to kind of to confront the possibility of her own mortality before it actually happens. That's nice. Also, you ever think that like if you're a soldier on the battlefield, like watching dragons fight each other, kind of Agent Smith and Neo style in the Matrix Resurrections, or I'm sorry, what's the final one? Revolutions, like in the sky, just like shooting fireballs at each other, like. Wouldn't that give you kind of an appreciation of man's insignificance? Like I went to see a total solar eclipse recently, which I would recommend. Like I traveled thousands of miles to be in the path of totality, and I felt like, oh wow, like truly we are insignificant beings on this rock that's hurtling through space.
Yeah. They should have named this episode "The Path of Totality."
That's how I imagine a soldier on the battlefield must already feel, even before the dragons, and then seeing the dragons, it's like, oh wow, my life really is insignificant.
Yeah.
So at least they got to have that, is what I'm saying.
Sure, the ones who survived
before the dragon blood lands on them.
Yeah,
and they get rolled over by a bunch of arrows.
What a story to tell your children.
Yes, you could say like, I saw the dragons fight each other, and that was cool. All right. What else? Yeah, we see like Vhagar getting thrown down, killing soldiers as she hits the ground, and just as Rhaenys seems to be heading back to Dragonstone, Aemond and Vhagar swoop in with a deadly attack, killing Meleys mid-air while Rhaenys falls to her death on Dragonback. And watching this too, yes, the tragedy of the death of Rhaenys and Meleys is very sad, but then I'm also like, oh my god, like how many people is this gonna kill when it hits the ground? And you get a sense of that too, which is like a shit ton. It's tragic because it I think it obliterates parts of the part of the castle.
Yeah,
right?
and lands the castle and blows up part of it.
Yeah.
Also, the fact that Aemond this time, like the whole like surprise swoop, reminded me a lot of how Luke died as well. Like I feel like it was similarly played, where it was like, oh, I think I might be fine, and then it's like, no, I'm not fine. She like.
That's Aemon's MO. He loves lulling his victims into a false sense of security for like 3 seconds.
Yeah. And then it's
before
like
swooping in.
The swoop from below is certainly the signature move at this point. But like, when that happened, when Luke died, you sort of like got this shot of Aemon being like, oh no, like I didn't mean for that to happen. The shot of Aemon this time is again so cold-blooded. Like he seems to feel no remorse for not only killing the dragon, but killing his, oh god, don't put me on the spot now about how he's related to Rhaenys. His relative, certainly.
Yeah. Well, a couple more things happen this episode. With Rhaenys dead, the Greens take the win in the battle. Unfortunately, Criston Cole is still alive, right? He has been knocked unconscious, but we see Alicent's brother, Gwaine, right? He kind of like leads the charge on the castle. And Criston Cole stumbles around, seeing the intense destruction from dragons as he makes his way to find Aegon. We see the shell of a soldier's armor left behind.
That was pretty.
Yeah, it's cool. It's very like nuclear attack style. Like, oh, this guy is just complete ash. Cole So we got to talk about this. Okay, Cole gets to the fallen dragon and finds Aemond is approaching too. And it is unclear exactly what Aemond is doing in that situation. Why is Aemond there? And basically, we see Aegon is on the ground with his dragon kind of curled up around him, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then the king, Aegon, is on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
I watched this scene like 4 times just to see kind of like what happened. We basically see, if I recall correctly, like a 1 to 2 second shot of Aegon on the ground. He's all messed up. He's like burned. It is unclear whether Aegon is alive at this point.
Mm-hmm.
We also see Aemond picking up the dagger, and the A Song of Ice and Fire dagger, and pointing it at the curled up dragon when Cole asks where his grace is. And so I think Kim, in the notes, you're speculating, and I agree with you. Like, was Aemond going to do Aegon harm prior to when Kristen showed up? Like, is Aegon even still alive? All open questions at the end of the episode. Do not reveal whether Aegon is still alive. But I am curious if you have any thoughts on how this scene was shot, because in my opinion, I think it is designed to be ambiguous and to leave the question open as to whether Aegon is still alive or not. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It felt like a cliffhanger
Yeah.
moment, which they don't do a lot in
Yeah.
House of the Dragon, if I'm remembering correctly. And I think I felt a twinge of annoyance at being left on a cliffhanger, especially with a show that one cannot binge watch through to the next
Yeah.
episode.
And
I love the week to week style of this HBO
Yeah.
show. It's great, but yeah, I think that this was a rare time where like we are left with a very ambiguous final shot that it would be irresponsible to speculate upon any further.
Yeah, we'll save that
like
for the bonus episode. Yeah.
The look on Kristen Cole's face too, like he looks so like, oh my god, like my plan, like the fact that they just won this battle, but it ends on this note of like, I fucked up, is like the look on Kristen Cole's face, right? Yeah.
Yes. It's not triumphant at all.
Right.
But what I thought of honestly is the episode with Jaime Lannister sinking into the water, right? I think that's the
the spoils of war. Yeah,
right. And it's like, oh, okay, is he really dead? I don't think so. But like the show is making it ambiguous as to whether or not he's going to survive or not.
Mm-hmm.
Jesse, any thoughts on how this episode comes to an end?
I actually really like the cliffhanger. I mean, obviously, I've read the book, so I know what happens after this. That may color my perception of this cliffhanger. And again, I won't speculate on it at all. But I do actually kind of enjoy moments like that. That sort of, especially after a big battle like this, it gives you a little bit of something extra to feed upon for next week. Because I feel like, especially with episodes like this, it's like, oh, that was a really badass battle, you can sometimes feel like, oh, next week is like, next week's never going to live up to that. So giving us this little like, oh, I need to see the fallout of this battle and what's going to happen to this character, it kind of at least gives you this feeling, like I gotta know what's coming back, and doesn't leave you this sense of like, oh man, next week's not going to live up to this week, So I do appreciate that stuff, and I also
just as a storytelling device, you're like, oh, they got their hooks in good with this.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I also will say the visuals were fantastic. Like, we kind of passed over it really briefly, but that shot where Kristen Cole does touch the guy with the ash and he sort of falls apart. Sorry if you're hearing a truck going by behind me. But yeah, they're just, the guy turning to ash was a really like hauntingly evocative image, as too was the shot of Aegon. The last shot of the episode was like very well composed and beautiful in its horror in a weird way. Like, there was some weird like painterly sort of visual to it. So yeah, I really enjoyed this ending. I thought it was a very strong ending, and anything that makes Criston Cole feel worse about his life is fine with me.
Indeed.
Anytime he gets traumatized, it's a win for us.
Yeah, I was not here for this episode making him look like an actual competent commander. Let's show him up a little bit. To be fair to him, this was not part of his plan. If everything had gone according to what he had wanted, it probably would have just been
total victory.
Wing. Yeah,
total victory. Yeah. It's just interesting to contemplate.
Mm-hmm.
I also think it's interesting. I guess we're going to talk more about the book stuff in bonus episode, but I was just going to say, like, the way that the show adapted what we know about this battle and like the plan basically, and turned it into this like deeper character sort of moment for both Criston Cole and Aemond, I thought was really, really great. So yeah, good ending note for like to have Aemond and Criston having to kind of like confront one another about what they've done.
The real feelings about his grace in this situation. Right.
Yeah.
Great episode. A lot of highs, a lot of lows. And again, just the act of getting, I remember when they were filming Battle of the Bastards or whatever, and reading about the logistical challenges of a shoot like that, and how like there's like dozens of horses and we need to figure out a place to put all the horse poop and like all this stuff that like you don't even think about that goes into shooting something like this. And it looks pretty good, I would say. It looks like, you know, some of the dragon stuff obviously looks very CG. The castle stuff, some of it looks CG, but like it looks like they did at least some of this stuff in real life. And I was pretty impressed. It's kind of one of those reasons why people watch the show is this episode. I will say, I think the reviewers online have been pretty extra about quote unquote preparing people for this episode. I don't know if you all have seen that stuff, but
I have seen some people being like, if you're not caught up, you have to be caught up now. And I was like,
this episode is so freaking epic. And it's like, yes, it's epic, but like you're kind of ruining it by like saying all that shit, in my opinion.
Overhyped.
You know, like, like just let people like it comes off as kind of braggy to me, you know. And I know I literally said one sentence about this episode at the end of last episode, and so I worry that I like went too far into that territory. But like the stuff I've seen posted is like way more spoilery in my opinion than like I typically have seen for this show. So
that's actually my issue with it, is that like the bragging, like, oh, I got to see this thing before you did, sort of element of it is annoying, but the element of like, oh, there is going to be a big epic battle here kind of ruins it, because you don't really know that until you get into the episode.
I agree. And we said nothing of the sort here on Cast of Kings. So anyway, all that said, great episode. Really good stuff. It's episodes like this are one of the reasons why we do podcasts like this one, is to be able to talk about them and react to them and marvel at them. And truly great episode. And hope you enjoyed listening to the three of us talk about it here on A Cast of Kings, a Decoding TV podcast. So anyway, I think that'll bring us to the end. Some more stuff to talk about in our bonus episode this week. So become a paid member at decodingtv.com if you want to hear how the book compared to the show. But until then, they are Jessie Earl and Kim Renfro. I'm David Chen. You're listening to A Cast of Kings, a Decoding TV podcast. Hey everyone, David Chen here. Thank you so much for watching that video from Decoding TV. If you want to get an audio version of the show, all you got to do is go to podcast.decodingtv.com. And if you want to support what we do, get ad-free episodes of the podcast and also bonus episodes of the podcast, go to decodingtv.com and become a paid member. Of course, you can also like and subscribe for more. We appreciate it. Thanks. See you later.